Hello there, and you're very welcome to this evening's reading, which is the second extract from the novel The Things We Know Now. I'd just like to thank everybody who sent me messages. It's lovely to hear from people and to know that I'm not speaking to myself, which becomes a more and more frequent feeling these days, I think, for all of us. It was particularly nice, I have to say, to hear from some former colleagues whom I haven't seen in many, many years. And that's also another feature, I think, of these very strange days where people from all aspects of our lives are getting in touch again. And that's great. So please continue to do so. So tonight is the second reading from the novel, The Things We Know Now. And when I read the first extract, I just gave a very brief summary, which I'll reprise now for anybody who wasn't at the last reading. You don't need to have been, but to say that the novel is the story in particular of Daniel, a young teenage boy, and his parents, Patrick and Ella. Patrick narrates the most part of the story, Daniel's father. He's in his mid-70s. Daniel is the son from a second relationship. Patrick had been married before and had three children, three daughters, Rebecca, Sophie, and Frances. In the previous extract that I read, we saw that there was a lot of tension between Rebecca and Patrick, her father, when she was a very young child. She felt that he hadn't treated her mother properly. She smacked him on the face one Christmas Eve when she was 4 and told him that she was angry with him because he had made her mummy cry. So in this extract, we turn to Rebecca as an adult. And at this point, it's 3 years since her beloved mother, Cecilia, died. But before we get to that point, her sisters contact her because Patrick, their father, is really grieving enormously the recent death of Cecilia, and he doesn't know how to cope, and they don't know how to cope with him. So this is just to give us an insight into Rebecca's character, her relationship with Patrick, and also her relationship with her sisters. She's a bit of a spiky character. The phone calls began almost at once. Certainly by the middle of February 1990, just a couple of weeks after my mother's death. Once the usual fuss had abated, I don't mean that unkindly. I just mean that neighbours, acquaintances, even friends had all gone back to their own lives after my mother's funeral, as people must. I certainly had. I'd no choice. But I don't think my father realised he'd be thrown back onto the scant resources of his own company quite so quickly. My sisters, Frances and Sophie, soon started calling me, one after the other. At that time, during the first 6 months or so of 1990, I was travelling a lot, particularly to and from the States. The private college I worked for back then had a sister organisation in Boston. Their senior lecturer had absconded with one of the secretaries, and the whole business had been thrown into chaos. And so I got roped in. Although my PhD was on hold, I was more than qualified to lecture to the junior students. Much against my will, I got shunted back and forth for months. I felt like the stopgap I was, and I was all too aware that I was being treated like this because I was the youngest and a woman. I hated all the travelling, the endless airports and the hotel rooms and the time differences. But in a way, such busyness distracted me from my grief and from what was going on at home. It was also, in a way, a relief not to be always available, not to be physically present back home. But my sister's calls certainly took their toll in other ways. I don't much like being a distant participant in a situation over which I have no control. Dad, my sisters said, wasn't eating. He wasn't leaving the house. He was drinking way too much whiskey. I listened and listened and listened, and then I was furious with him. We three had all had to get on with our own lives, despite the yawning, grief-filled gap that each slow day did nothing to lessen. Why didn't he at least make an effort? My mother's absence was still a physical ache, a weight that pressed down upon me, waking and sleeping. I knew, no matter what, that my father had to be suffering similarly. I tried to make allowances. Each time my sisters phoned, I was, I believe, both sympathetic and sensible in my suggestions as to how to handle him. But nothing worked. It felt like a very long few weeks to me, and in fairness, even longer for my sisters. I returned home from the States hoping to fly back, as it were, below my sisters' radars. I'd been deliberately vague with each of them about the date of my return. I now know that it was my husband, Adam, who told them not only the date, but the time and the number of my flight. I've often wondered about that. Was it an early attempt by my husband to punish me for abandoning him every couple of weeks? I'll never be sure. But I do know that he never had any problem spending all that I earned. No problem at all. And so I barely landed when they called again. Francis early on the morning of my arrival, just as I was getting into my car at the airport. Sophie called late that same afternoon, waking me from that awful, sluggish, post-time difference sleep. And then Francis phoned again in the evening. Both of my sisters sounded distraught. It was a Friday, I remember. I'd had the week from hell, and that's apart from the developing jet lag. I was longing for an evening without interruptions. Before my sister's outbursts, an empty weekend had stretched out languidly in front of me. I couldn't wait to kick off my shoes and curl up in front of the television. I wanted to doze my way through Saturday morning, then go for a walk, maybe have lunch by the sea somewhere with Adam, whom I'd hardly seen in 9 weeks. The last thing I wanted was to drive right into the epicenter of an emotional ice storm. It's not just about looking after himself, Rebecca. It's not just the practical stuff that's causing problems. All that can be taken care of. I heard Francis take a deep breath. Dad has imploded. I can't think of any other word for it. It's not just sadness. It's as though he's given up living. I'm actually frightened that he might do something to harm himself. Francis is not an alarmist. I decided I'd better go and support her and Sophie as soon as I could manage it. I'll drive up early on Sunday, I suggested. I tried to sound both firm and tired. There was a pause. You don't understand, Francis said. I wouldn't have rung you again if I didn't think it was an emergency. Sophie and I haven't slept in 2 nights. You have to come now. What about Dr. Eugene? I stalled. My father had always had great time for stolid, unimaginative Dr. Eugene. Personally, I thought he was old-fashioned, out of touch with current medical practice, and limited in his diagnoses. But then, who was I to be choosy at a time like this? Francis's reply was chilly. I knew the tone well, from all those other occasions in the past on which she and I had crossed swords. Eugene is away. He has a locum, a woman I've never even met. Do you really think it's wise to bring a stranger into the middle of this crisis, given the state Dad is in? And that is how, at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening, I found myself driving through freezing early March rain to meet my sisters at my father's house. I'll admit, his condition shocked me. He looked gaunt, old. He'd always taken great pride in his appearance. I think he's always had a wide streak of vanity in his nature. But now he was unshaven, his corduroy trousers stained and baggy, his shirt reeking of perspiration. Come with me, Dad. I dumped my overnight bag in the corner of the living room. I hadn't even taken off my coat. He looked at me, finally registering my presence. Almost without thinking, I'd used my mother's tone. I think it was my voice that sparked that instant of recognition, that flash of something in his eyes that looked like hope. I know, too, that I look like Cecilia did when she was young, much more so than either Francis or Sophie do. And I played on that, shaking my hair free of the combs I'd used to restrain it. My father stood up, followed me like a lamb. I think my sisters were relieved to have me take charge. To them, his disintegration had been gradual. He became just a little more unkempt every day, a little more cranky, a little more solitary. To me, the change was astonishing, like a slap in the face. We took the stairs slowly, and I became aware of his laboured breathing. What on earth, I thought, and why didn't they call me sooner? But wisely on that occasion, I said nothing, nothing at all. When we reached his room, he sat heavily on the bed, and I left him. I'll be back in a minute. I turned on the shower and led him by the hand into the bathroom. You need to wash, Dad. My tone was stern. Take your time, and I'll have clean clothes ready when you are. He showered and dressed. We made tea and sandwiches, and all of us sat around the kitchen table. On that occasion, my father wept and shuddered and drew long, shaky breaths. Other than that, he was uncommunicative. He shook his head every time one of us spoke, and eventually we helped him up the stairs to bed. I sent both my sisters home. Their exhausted faces were too much for me. I told them to sleep, to take time out, to stay away from our father's house until Sunday. Then I called Adam to say I'd be away until Sunday night at the earliest. And then I began a silent rehearsal of what I was going to say to my father over breakfast. Okay, so then we fast forward to the 3 years that I mentioned earlier. And Patrick has now met somebody, a woman called Ella. And Rebecca, to put it mildly, does not approve. I had no wish to meet this Ella person. When the invitation came, I had no wish either to make the journey of an hour and a half, 2 if the traffic was bad, when the Sunday papers, my own garden, and a glass of good wine were way more appealing. But my sisters were adamant. I may have once been the cavalry arriving at the 11th hour when they needed me, but my sisters had fought a more lengthy fight, the good fight as they would see it, on our father's behalf. I had to accept that, however unwillingly. And Francis and Sophie never lost an opportunity to remind me, lest I forget. What is all of this about? I demanded. I mean, how ridiculous, how inappropriate is this infatuation? It's embarrassing, that's what it is. We were sitting in Francis's kitchen, the 3 of us. Our men had made themselves scarce, drifting away out into the morning sunshine on the deck, cans of beer in hand. We'd agreed to meet here at midday, an hour or so before we all obeyed the royal summons to our old family home for lunch. Francis, Martin, Sophie, and Peter were already here when Adam and I arrived. I couldn't help the feeling that the 4 of them had planned this as a preemptive strike. You're overreacting, Rebecca. Francis's mouth had become a thin, disapproving line as I spoke. Give her a chance. She makes Dad happy. Sophie nodded, watching me warily as she poured the coffee. I, however, was determined to be heard. A chance, I said. A chance for what? She's a gold digger, plain and simple. I hadn't meant to be so blunt. Not at first, but my sense of indignation had got a firmer grip than I'd thought. Why do you insist on thinking the worst? I could see that Francis was beginning to get upset, and I was glad. Now we'll come to the nub of it, I thought. At last we can confront it, what we've each been pussyfooting around for months. She sat down beside me, her face a little closer to mine than I would have wished. In the background, Sophie, silent Sophie, stood by the patio door and exhaled nervous blue smoke out into the Sunday morning air. She hadn't smoked since our mother's funeral, or at least that was the last time I had seen her do so. Let me tell you a couple of home truths. I was startled at Frances's tone. It was harsher than I would have expected. When Mum died, you know that Sophie and I picked up the pieces for months. I made to protest, but Frances wouldn't let me. Wait, just listen to me. You live over 100 kilometres away. Nobody expected you to be here on a daily basis. What I'm saying is not an accusation. It's a fact. I waited. We did his washing, his ironing, his cleaning. We fed him and minded him. We dropped in several times a week. We rang you only when we felt we didn't know what we were dealing with. We had, on an everyday basis, what you saw both times you arrived here. Dr. Eugene was horrified. It was he who insisted that Dad be persuaded to go for counselling. We'd run out of options at that stage. I didn't need to be reminded. I remembered all too well both of those appalling visits home. And don't think it stopped there, Frances went on. Just because the crises were further and further apart doesn't mean he was all sweetness and light to deal with in between. She paused. He lived a roller coaster of emotions for months, and by definition, so did we. She glanced over at Sophie. We didn't call you because we were able to handle most of it between us, but don't think it was easy. Sophie turned at that point towards where we were sitting. She didn't speak, but I saw her watch Frances closely. I think, Frances said, that we can all count ourselves lucky he has found someone. To be very blunt about it, and I'll only speak for myself, it has taken an intolerable burden off me. She paused. I'm sorry, Rebecca, but I'm pretty damn determined to like what I see this afternoon. Then Sophie spoke. She'd always spent more time observing than speaking, even as a child. What's the real problem here, Rebecca? I don't think you're being honest with us. To my dismay, I felt my eyes fill. It's way too soon, I blurted. I couldn't stop myself. How can he discard Mum so easily? Frances stiffened. How can you say that? Sophie stubbed out her cigarette. You have no idea, she said, looking directly at me. You have no idea how that man grieved. I said nothing. And how do you know? Frances's voice was even, controlled, but I could sense the effort. How do you know that he's not still grieving now? Just because he's found someone else does not diminish what he had with Mum. He's entitled to grieve and recover at the same time. She stopped. What gives you the right to judge? It was my turn to get angry. That doesn't change the fact that it all happened so quickly. It's not appropriate. For Christ's sake, she's 20 years younger than him. I paused. She could be his daughter. Silence in the kitchen was a shocked one. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Martin begin to make his way back in from the garden, crushed and empty beer cans in hand. He took one look at Frances's face and he retreated. Is that what this is about? Sophie's voice was soft. Your feelings? Your sense of moral outrage, rather than Dad's happiness? I stood up, dusted down my skirt. Don't be so melodramatic, I said. Even I could hear the coldness in my tone. I tried to soften it. It's about everything, I said. I think she's taking advantage of him. And yes, I still feel that it's an insult to Mum. I looked from one of my sisters to the other. And it's way too soon. How long would you like him to wait then? Asked Frances. And what would you like him to do in the meantime? She glanced over at Sophie. What would you like us to do in the meantime? I could hear something dangerous growing in my sister's words. Would you like to come here and look after him? I could see Adam's shadow at the door. I knew that he was standing on the deck, listening. He's only 54, I protested. For Christ's sake, he's well capable of looking after himself. Says who? Sophie walked towards me, her eyes alight. He should be, but the truth is, he's never had to. It's one hell of a learning curve. Would you like to come and teach him? I held up both my hands, a gesture of faux surrender. Have it your own way, I said, but this will end badly. Okay, thank you very much for your company, and please continue to send me messages on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or email. And as usual, this reading has been held in collaboration with the Holding Cell. So if you like this and you'd like some more, please tune in again on Thursday at the same time, the same YouTube channel. Stay safe, stay well, and stay home, at least for now. Bye until then.